I'm going to take that as a yes. Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for a great morning so far. And it's my absolute pleasure now to kick off the afternoon by chairing this keynote session and to introduce our very special guest, Dr. Kate Egan. Kate is a senior lecturer in film and media at Northumbria University. She's co-founder and co-convener of the BAFTA's Horror Studies Subject Interest Group. She's the author of Trash and Treasure, Censorship and the Changing Meanings of the Video Nasties, and Cultography's The Evil Dead, and the co-author of Alien Audiences. She's also co-edited Cult Film Stardom, and last year's, and now for something completely different, Critical Approaches to Monty Python, was very recently released, I think, wasn't it? Yeah. Unless it's 2020 kind of blurring into one for me. I don't know where, what time is even anymore. Yes, and Kate has also co-edited the forthcoming collection researching historical screen audiences. Her current research is practice-based and focuses on the Dirt in the Gate cinema events and their audiences at Shelley Theatre Bournemouth, which is fabulous, and everybody should go if they have the opportunity. And this is as part of some larger future research plans on audience memories of horror film and TV, which leads us very nicely into her keynote lecture today, which is titled Nostalgia for Pre-Digital Scares, Childhood Memories, Horror, and 35mm. I'm going to hand over to you, Kate. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm so delighted to be invited to keynote this fantastic conference. I've enjoyed the papers so much today that I've heard already. Now I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work. There we are. Okay. So as Laura indicated, my kind of current interest, although it's something that's been there as a fascination really throughout my academic career, as I'll illustrate in a moment, is kind of nostalgia about consuming horror. So in terms of, this conference and the kind of papers on nostalgia that we've heard already and that we will continue to hear during the course of these 2 days, my paper is very much concerned with the operation of nostalgia amongst audiences. So rather than the operation of nostalgia within media texts, it's very much about audience nostalgia about past experiences of consuming and encountering media texts. And many of the papers that we've heard already have kind of bridged the two in really interesting ways. This paper is very, very much focused on the operation of nostalgia amongst audiences in terms of their viewing histories. And consequently, and just a kind of disclaimer before I start, there will be quite a lot of quotations from audience members and memories from audiences that I'll be including in my PowerPoint and citing and kind of engaging with during the course of this talk. So it's going to be very text heavy as a result, just to kind of warn you really. So yeah, I'm specifically interested in the ways in which people's memories of first encountering horror films, or their first memories, that they can recollect of being affected by horror films, relate to expressions of nostalgia for those experiences in the present day. So as Vanessa May has argued in your work on nostalgia and memory, citing Michael Pickering and Emily Knightley, nostalgia is a complex way of orienting to and engaging with the past, not merely an expression of sentimental regret. And that the spirit of that kind of perspective on nostalgia has been evident already through many of the papers that I've heard today in the conference, and it's something that is very much at the heart of what I'm trying to do as well. And I've, as I mentioned, had a long-term kind of obsession. I was going to use the term fascination, but really I should be honest and say obsession with researching how that kind of process, how that kind of idea of nostalgia might relate to audience memories of their first childhood encounters with horror related media. I'm particularly fascinated with memories of horror because often they relate to formative experiences in people's lives, whether you're kind of hardened horror fans or whether you're just people who've encountered horror during the course of your life, with being scared, and being affected by horror texts. And therefore, I think encountering horror in all forms, and I'm going to focus on film specifically in this paper, but in all forms in terms of television as well, consequently can have a kind of memorable effects on people, and can be, I would argue, easily recalled when people think about their film viewing experiences. And that's something I want to explore at more length today. But as I say, my obsession with nostalgia about being scared through horror has kind of crossed my entire academic career, starting with my first monograph in 2007, Trash or Treasure, Censorship and Changing Meaning of the Video Nasties. So what I encountered there, and it was really an unexpected aspect of this research. You know, the research really, based on my PhD thesis, was historical, and it was interested in exploring the ways in which the banning of these particular films as video nasties in the UK, these particular horror films that were on the video nasties list, how their meanings kind of shifted and changed through time as they became available again in the UK, but those kind of notions of illicitness kind of stuck to them in various ways. And the kind of engagement of fans in the nasties was kind of key to my exploration within that context of nostalgia and memory. So in that book, I engaged with adult fans of the video nasties and their memories of renting at quite young ages, between the ages of around 10 and 14, a large number of pre-certificate video nasties from video shops, watching them with friends frequently, and spending a large amount of time at school as well, discussing titles like The Evil Dead and Cannibal Holocaust and so on. And then also considering the ways in which nostalgia for those childhood experiences and consumption kind of activities informed then, in the kind of early 2000s when I was conducting this research, largely engaging with fan discourse online, but I also conducted some interviews with video nasty fans as well, their video nasty collecting practices, their online archiving kind of activities, their archiving of the history of the video nasties, as well as their fandom for horror films more broadly. So those memories that they had of first encountering those films on video as quite young children clearly informed their subsequent activities around these films as adults. And that was something that really, really fascinated me. And I've put here an indicative quotation from one of those websites from the time, which illustrates the kind of memories that people of encountering horror films at this time as children, the kind of memories that were put online. So here's one here. So yes, I did get to see quite a few horror movies, including some of those mythical nasties on Friends VCRs. Despite the virulent crackdown on all things dubious, there were still a number of local shops that had the odd unsavoury item tucked away on a dusty shelf and would turn a blind eye to a trembling 14-year-old with his parents' video card. So it's this kind of nostalgia for that kind of period, a kind of period that, you know, is really collectively valued by many, many horror fans in the UK. Then in my book on The Evil Dead, which was broadly about the cult reputation of The Evil Dead and the history of that cult reputation, I also there uncovered numerous really fan reminiscences online of people who first encountered the film at some point in the 1980s, again when the film was available on home video, when again they were very young teenagers. So the age range cited was generally again between 10 and 14, although there were some fans who stated that they first watched The Evil Dead when they were about 5 or 6 years old. And in all the cases, in all these kind of fan reminiscences, the film had stood out for people on first viewing when they recalled their first encounters with the film, because it had scared the hell out of them, and for many had led to kind of nightmares and sleepless nights. And I'll come back to think further about that later in the paper, that notion of a kind of nostalgia for that time when horror could scare people, and the way in which that nostalgia can be extremely pleasurable for people recalling those childhood encounters with particular horror films. In 2013, I also looked at how male horror fans celebrated the sadly departed horror actress Ingrid Pitt, especially her appearance in the 1970 Hammer film, The Vampire Lovers, in relation to kind of memories of their sexual awakening, the way in which Ingrid Pitt had that kind of impact on male horror fans when they were young. And then in sort of 2012 to 15, I was also, I'm proud to say, involved in the Alien Audiences International Audience Project, which was conducted by Martin Barker, Tom Phillips, Sarah Ralph and myself, and was designed to kind of gather people's memories of the original 1979 Alien film as its 40th anniversary drew near. So the book of findings based on this project, which is entitled Alien Audiences, Remembering and Evaluating a Classic Movie, was key in my view. And I can say this because actually I think this contribution to the book, I'd lay much more at the door of my esteemed co-authors, Tom Phillips and Sarah Ralph, was really key, I think, in establishing within kind of audience memory studies associated with film and television, the important role of the family in early encounters with horror, kind of post-1960s. So close to 40% of our project respondents, people who responded to that particular audience project, mentioned members of their family when recounting their first viewing of the film. And the Alien Audiences Project also acknowledged the markedly, again, there's this kind of theme. It shocked me, I have to say, that I kept uncovering this theme. The early age at which many respondents had first encountered Alien, or at least the early age they reported they first encountered it. So many had first viewed the film at the age of 7 or even younger. Now, of course, I'm not alone in this interest and fascination in the ways in which people reflect on their childhood encounters with horror through reminiscence and through kind of their responses to talking about horror. So really important book, I think, and one that's now being consistently recognised as being really important in terms of thinking about childhood encounters with horror. Other researchers who are interested in children and horror have also cited the importance of this book, including people like Kat Lester, who has got an excellent book forthcoming on children's horror films, and she has acknowledged the importance of David Buckingham's work from 1996, the book Moving Images, Understanding Children's Emotional Responses to Television, where he talked to children about their emotional responses to viewing horror films as part of this wider book and project. So, of course, these were contemporary responses from children at the time the research took place, or just before the book was published anyway, rather than adult memories of past childhood responses to horror. But this research uncovered some key aspects of childhood viewing habits relating to horror media, including the notion of reflecting on the experience of fear, and being scared as a pleasurable experience, which, as I mentioned, is something I'm going to come back to and explore in more detail in a little while. Also, obviously a classic book for anybody interested in audience memories and reminiscences about film viewing in all its forms. Annette Kuhn's book, An Everyday Magic, 2002, devoted a chapter to an illuminating analysis within that chapter of 1930s British cinema goers' childhood memories of watching horror, and again of being frightened in a pleasurable, often in a pleasurable way at the pictures, or at least it's remembered as pleasurable from the perspective of the present, looking back to those past encounters and memories. Then in 2005, you have Matt Hills's again groundbreaking book, wide-ranging book, Pleasures of Horror, which focuses in its section on horror and fan practices, on really illuminating published or online fan accounts of the pleasures of watching horror, including fan accounts of people's first encounters with horror and their kind of importance to fan identities and to their kind of history of engagement with horror. More recently, I really want to kind of celebrate this particular piece of work. This is a PhD, recently completed PhD thesis, which was conducted at Northumbria University, remembering the scariest movie of all time, a grounded audience study of The Exorcist. In this particular really excellent piece of research by Martin Smith, he analyses how audiences have engaged with, now remember, The Exorcist through memories gathered from 746 survey respondents and 32 interviewees. And crucially and importantly, the memories Smith gathered once again, and this kind of builds, I think, on many of the insights from the Alien Audiences Project, the young age, again, at which many participants had first seen The Exorcist, with, as he notes, kind of 13 being the kind of average age that his respondents report first seeing The Exorcist. And really crucially, and this is something I'm going to explore at length throughout the rest of this paper, the importance of the home as a venue for film watching from the home video era and onwards, and the way in which the space of the home, the culture of the home, and the context of the home plays a key role within people's memories of encountering horror when they look back and recall them, that the home is a key kind of site within which those memories kind of take place and which they're staged. And Smith really rightly, I think, because this is a really important assertion he makes in his thesis, he notes the extent to which this venue, the venue of the home, and its significance as a venue for film watching in people's pasts, has been kind of underexplored to date in work on cinema memories within the kind of broad new cinema history tradition. So this tradition of work, much of which is represented by the excellent Homer network, the History of Movie-Going Exhibition and Reception network, is continually producing kind of groundbreaking models, methodologies and concepts for studying and researching the history of movie-going. But as Smith rightly notes, this is primarily focused to date upon memories of cinema going up to around 1960. So as Annette Coombe, Daniel Biltreist and Philip Mears put it in the introduction to a special issue of Memory Studies Journal devoted to this tradition of work, much of it has tended to focus on film going in the decades of the 20th century before the arrival of the multiplex, home cinema and other changes in modes of film exhibition and consumption, when going to the cinema was an essential leisure time activity for millions everywhere. So with this in mind, Smith concludes his analysis of his gathered Exorcist-related memories by noting very valuably that in the post-1960 kind of consumption context, that the majority of film viewing experiences take place within the home is unarguable, that the family context is important in how films are watched is indisputable. At no time does this apply more than when one watches as a child. The home is a vital aspect of audiences' stories with any given film, not only due to the prevalence of home viewing, but due to the huge varieties in experience afforded by the relationships around which routines form. I'm going to build on these observations in a moment, particularly in relation to that kind of underlined idea of the home becoming, in people's kind of memories of experiencing horror kind of post-1960s, that it becomes a kind of vital aspect of audiences' kind of recollections of encountering horror post-1960. I just want to finally flag it before I move on in terms of kind of charting this tradition of work that's developing around memories of encounters with horror. To bring us kind of bang up to date, we have Pete Turner's project, Memories of Underage Film Viewing in 1980s Britain, which has also taken up that call, I think, to explore, you know, the home in relationship to those kind of viewing practices. So in that study, which is ongoing, Pete Turner will explore the memories of underage film viewers of the 1980s in the UK, analysing their film viewing experiences, habits, tastes and memories. So I'm personally really, I know Pete is here, and I hope you don't, if he is, I hope you don't mind me advertising your project here, Pete. I know it's ongoing at the moment. I'm personally really excited to hear more about the results of this project. And if anyone here is interested in taking part, there's more information at that particular address on my slide. Now, what I want to do for the rest of this paper is to explore in more detail what I hope are complementary and related findings on memories of underage horror consumption and their kind of nostalgic significance and meaning. Through something that Laura mentioned at the beginning, a current project that I'm working on, which is a wider practice-based project that I've been conducting since March 2019 with my wonderful co-researcher, Jamie Terrell, who is, I presume is here, and I'm looking forward to hearing his paper in a panel later today. So the original aim of this particular project that Jamie and I are currently conducting was to make a film, a completely new venture for me, which is, you know, very, very provisionally titled Horror Film Events and Their Audiences, and which aims to focus on audience practices at horror film events, particularly in relationship to gender and generation. And we hope that when we, God knows when it'll happen because of COVID, but when we finally finish this film, our aim is to potentially make it available as an educational resource for teaching horror cinema and teaching genre cinema and also media audiences as well. Now, today and kind of pre-COVID, the project had focused on one particular case study, and increasingly, because this particular case study is so fascinating and is yielding such rich results, it may become the primary focus of our project. And that's Dirt in the Gate movies. Laura mentioned it at the beginning of this session. Dirt in the Gate movies is an event that was held regularly pre-COVID at the Mary Shelley Theatre, Bournemouth. And we very much hope to return there, Jamie and I, in hopefully safer times, in order to conduct further research on this particular event and to capture more footage of it. Now, to give you some background on this, because I'm going to focus on this event and its audiences as a particular case study for the majority of this paper, I want to give you some further background about Dirt in the Gate movies. So Dirt in the Gate movies are run primarily by the husband and wife team, Darren and Ruby Payne, and they specialise in 35mm film exhibition. So their first screening in April 2015 was of the film Reanimator. And at that point, that was just a one-off screening to raise funds for a local charity at the then newly reopened and partially restored Mary Shelley Theatre. You can see it there. It's the main theatre, the archway and the screen in that image on the top right of my PowerPoint slide. Mary Shelley Theatre was originally built in 1866. I think it's the oldest theatre, remaining theatre in Bournemouth. And it was built as a private theatre belonging to Sir Percy Florence Shelley, son of Percy, indeed of Percy Bysshe Shelley and Mary Shelley. So this one-off event, screening Reanimator in 35mm, occurred in April 2015 in this theatre, and the organisers, Darren Ruby, was so bowled over and encouraged by the enthusiasm and feedback they got from the audience. The event was sold out. That they soon moved on after that event to host regular 35mm screenings at the theatre. They installed brand new 35mm projectors from Italy, and they began operating under that banner of Dirt in the Gate movies. So up until March 2020, so basically, March 2019, so basically up until the beginning of last year's first lockdown, Dirt in the Gate had held over 60 individual film screenings, including 3 annual Grindfest festivals held in September 2017, 18 and 19, which ran over a day or more. And as they note on the BFI Film Hub Southwest website, the mission of Dirt in the Gate, its primary mission, is to keep authentic film, i.e. analog film in both 35mm and 16mm form, in the public eye for as long as possible. And we often dig deep to source rare film prints and the associated licenses, which is sometimes a challenging but ultimately rewarding process. And indeed, during the course of their history, they have worked extremely hard to source 35mm prints of all the films that they've screened from around the world, from as far afield as Canada and New Zealand. But while their primary aim and kind of USP has been to champion 35mm and keep it in the public eye, as they say there in their mission statement, the majority of their screenings have been horror films, primarily from the 1970s and 1980s. And apologies for the very small font there, but I've tried my best to squish in this PowerPoint slide the full range of horror films that Darren and Ruby and team have shown during the course of their history as Dirt in the Gate movies, from April 2015 right up until their last Grindhouse event in September 2019. There are a number of reasons why they have primarily focused on horror. When Jamie and I interviewed Darren and Ruby, they outlined that for us. So firstly, Darren Payne, who has worked as a film projectionist for many years, is a long-term horror film fan himself, who, as he noted, was kind of brought up on horror from the age of 5 or 6, when he used to lace up his dad's 8mm projector with classic horror films like Bride of Frankenstein. So he has that investment in horror himself. But really crucially, what was evident to Darren and Ruby from the very beginning of Dirt in the Gate, so from the first screening of Reanimator onwards, was that the horror films they showed, so they have also showed romantic comedies and dramas as well. They've shown things like Casablanca and Mannequin, for instance. They've shown a wide range of romantic comedies. The horror films they showed seemed to be what their most loyal repeat audiences wanted. So Ruby noted, for instance, that their most loyal repeat attendees come back primarily for the horror films and tend to be far more interactive and communal than the audiences that have attended their non-horror film screenings. Now, Ruby, who is kind of front of house for Dirt in the Gate, she consistently talks to and interacts with people who attend regularly. She told me that during these screenings, she got the impression in particular that many of the horror films that they'd screened, many of which had sold out when they were screened by Dirt in the Gate, were ones that their attendees had seen growing up, and that it seemed that there was a kind of not only a nostalgic element in relationship to the projection of 35mm, but also very, very much in relationship to the particular films that were being shown in 35mm at these events. So as part of our film project, I mean, this is an ongoing project. We hope to continue to conduct research, hopefully in safer times. But to date, Jamie and I have conducted filmed interviews around film screenings. We've gone to the events, taken part in the screenings, and then grabbed people for interviews, for filmed interviews around screenings. To date, we've interviewed 12 regular attendees of Dirt in the Gate, 2 women and 10 men. 10 of these interviewees were between the ages of 40 and 55, while 2 were in their 20s, but all 12 outlined in the interview context the ways in which the horror focus of these screenings related to their memories of and their nostalgia about, in different ways, their engagement with horror during their childhood. So, as part of my kind of ongoing fascination and mapping of childhood encounters with horror media and their relation to forms of nostalgia, I want to now kind of pull out, or try to pull out, some of the key trends I've identified across these interviews, the ones that we've conducted to date with Dirt in the Gate audience members, and to consider how they might relate to and build on the ongoing models and insights and concepts that a range of scholars, many of whom I've outlined in my previous slides, are developing about memories of childhood encounters with horror and their nostalgic significance to them in the present day. And towards the end of the paper, if I have time, I also want to go back a little bit to the alien audiences data sets and to look for some further evidence there of some of the tendencies that I've discovered amongst our interviewees at Dirt in the Gate. So first of all, I think it's important for context to acknowledge the full range of key reasons these interviewees at Dirt in the Gate gave for why they regularly attend the Dirt in the Gate screenings. So importantly, and as illustrated in these quotations on the slide, the Dirt in the Gate events were clearly seen to be a different and distinct kind of viewing experience because of clearly their consistent focus on 35mm prints and the nostalgia and kind of related magic, as you can see here in some of these quotations and some of the underlying segments of them associated with this, as well as appreciation of the work that these interviewees know has gone into sourcing as well as projecting these prints. So you can see this kind of appreciation here of the special nature of these events. And also, as you can see in the second quotation there from Matt, the nostalgia associated with that in certain ways. And the sense in Rob's quotation there, that there's something quite magical about film running through a projector. So there's this sense that it's distinct, and it's also, to an extent, a nostalgically pleasurable experience to experience the now increasingly rare sort of encounter with 35mm projection in that way. These events were also, and this very much echoed the comments of the organisers when Jamie and I have talked to them, these were seen to be kind of special and pleasurable events because they brought together people with a shared interest in watching these films in a 35mm format, as illustrated by these quotations on the slide, which I'm going to read out here. So Carl noted, Suspiria, which is one of the films that Dirt in the Gate was screening at the time we interviewed Carl, they've just announced there's going to be a 4K Blu-ray of it. It'll look fantastic. It'll look better than what we see tonight. But watching it won't be anywhere near as good as what we're doing tonight, because I'm going to be in a room of like-minded people. Whereas Nathan notes, you feel at home in an audience of people who are excited about watching something in 35mm. Whereas Matt notes, because it's a specialised area, so you know everyone attending would be interested in what you were going to see. It wasn't sort of a general public event. People had to make an effort to go and see something like that. So I think that was part of the attraction. So you can see the ways in which the 35mm context here, which obviously is at the forefront of Dirt in the Gate's kind of mission, is very, very much key to the appeal of these events, and presents them as kind of quite magical and special occasions. It should also be noted really interestingly, and this is something that Jamie and I are particularly fascinated in, as I know the organisers are, and I'm very proud of as well, that particularly compared to much kind of larger horror-related events like the annual Fright Fest event in London, the gender balance of the audience at many of the Dirt in the Gate screenings was quite balanced. It was quite a mixed audience in terms of gender. Unfortunately, we've not currently been able to interview as many women as men. The men have been far more forthcoming in coming forward to discuss the Dirt in the Gate events and their history with horror with us. But certainly that's something that we found very, very interesting, as well as the fact that these events were obviously much easier for local people to attend, people who had children or work responsibilities, than a big city horror event like Fright Fest. So you're getting different kinds of audiences here attending the Dirt in the Gate events than perhaps you would at some of the bigger festivals, city-based festivals around the country. Beyond this then, for those interviewees who are 40 plus that we've talked to, the nostalgia associated with the projection of 35mm at these events also seemed to connect in interesting ways to home video, which was identified by the majority of interviewees as the means through which they had originally encountered many of the horror films that had been screened at Dirt in the Gate events. So here's some examples of that, which I'm going to read out here. So Iris noted, for instance, the fact you're seeing film on film, the clicking of the film through the projector. I was born in the late 1960s, so a lot of films I saw in the 80s, but I didn't see them at the cinema. I saw them on video, so seeing them on screen is really great. They're classic films for me. They remind me of being a teenager. Whereas Nigel notes, when I was a kid growing up, I didn't go to the cinema too often because there wasn't one. So I watched most things on video, but even when I watched films on video, there were movies that were shot on film. So there's a very specific look that they have. With film, it feels like you're looking into a window and there's depth in the image, whereas digital feels more like a flat screen. I would love to see House 1 and 2 screened at Dirt in the Gate. I saw them as a kid. They were kind of an introduction for me, because out of all these videos, House was the one I was able to watch. I loved it since I was a kid, and it's got so much fun and imagination in it. I'd love to see it on film, big and loud. Whereas the last one here from Rob, he's talking about 35mm as a very physical medium. And then he notes, I've really got into collecting VHS in the last couple of years. And there's something really nice when you have the scratches and the pops and the things like that. It makes it more of a tangible experience. So for me, what's being emphasized here in these accounts are two kind of contradictory ideas, I think, when these attendees of Dirt in the Gate talk about and make connections between the appeal of watching these films in 35mm in the present day and their previous encounters with these horror films in their past. So firstly, you've got the idea established there very clearly in Iris and Nigel's accounts that seeing these films on the big screen, big and loud, as Nigel puts it, is pleasurable, and that this pleasure stems in many respects from their childhood memories of watching these films, which clearly it kind of informs why they see these screenings as pleasurable. It's kind of fitting for these films to be commemorated by being shown not on video, but on a big cinema screen, because they're films that they have an emotional investment with from their past. So putting those, even though they've experienced those in a home environment, putting those on a big screen for them is a worthy way to kind of commemorate those experiences. But at the same time, in these accounts here, there's a sense that there's a kind of continuity in various ways between their initial encounters with these films on video and the fact that they're being projected now in 35mm because of that physicality and tangibility of both mediums. And as Nigel in particular emphasises, their common status, video and analogue film, as analogue and not digital mediums, which therefore kind of signify the past, and to use Goran Bolin's term for his work on in his work on media generations, the kind of native media of their generation, that they can draw on that native media of home video and connect it to 35mm as non-digital experiences that have that kind of affinity and continuity and can allow them to make a connection back to their original experiences of seeing these films in different circumstances on home video. In this sense, then, I would argue that these kind of connections that are being made in these responses from attendees of Dirt in the Gate can be conceived in some respects as examples of what, and obviously Svetlana Boym has been mentioned many times already during the course of this conference, but I would argue that in some respects what we're getting here is a kind of reflective nostalgia in these connections that are being made by the Dirt in the Gate attendees, in the way that these attendees can be seen in Vanessa May's terms to be reflecting on the positive value that the remembered past, so their childhood encounters with first seeing these films on video, the way that can have an impact on their present, the way it kind of enhances their enjoyment of the screening of these films in 35mm prints at Dirt in the Gate events. Beyond this key insight from the interviews conducted so far, the interviews also, as a result of this discussion about Dirt in the Gate's appeal, opened a gateway into further discussion of their memories of their first childhood encounters with horror films, which chimed with but also built on some of the existing scholarly insights on memories of childhood horror consumption. So very much chiming with the arguments of Barker, Egan, Phillips and Ralph, and Martin Smith, members of the family, as you can see in these memories here, both dads and mums and uncles, were seen to play kind of key roles in many of these memories of early encounters with horror that were recounted by attendees of from Dirt in the Gate. The way in which, particularly, as you can see from these examples, family members acted as kind of gatekeepers, enabling access to these films, considering that many of these interviewees were underage at the time that they first encountered horror. These memories are also quite performative, particularly the last one there from Mike on the slide, which also chimes with this idea from the Alien Audiences Project that performative memories often suggest the intensified significance of these memories because of the fact that they involve family members. So their connection with horror, their first encounters with horror, are key because they involved family members in their viewing and their encounters with scary media like horror. In Alien Audiences, we related this observation to David B. Pillamer's summarization of the oft-employed concept within memory studies of a personal event memory, which for him has the following features. It's a memory of a specific event that took place at a particular time and place. The person can provide a detailed account of the rememberer's own personal circumstances at the time of the event. The memory has sensory images, including visual, auditory, olfactory images or bodily sensations that contribute to the feeling of re-experiencing or reliving the event. And the memory details and sensory images correspond to a particular moment or moments of phenomenal experience. As Janet Steiger has also noted in your overview of work on personal event memories, if the event remembered provoked an emotional reaction, that also increases its impact as well. So the utility and applicability of the concept of personal event memories to the recalling of first childhood encounters with horror should be evident from this kind of summary. And it's something we explored to an extent in the Alien Audiences Project, where we primarily related this conception of kind of the sensory nature of personal event memories to audience memories which recalled, in particular, the sensory aspects of the film Alien itself. So its memorable sights, its memorable sounds. But I would argue that this conception of the sensory aspects of personal event memories is also applicable to memories associated with feeling scared, either during the viewing of the film or afterwards, particularly at night in bed, as in these memories from Dirt in the Gate interviewees. And if I have time, I would like to read them out very, very briefly. So the first one from Matt. I went round a friend's house and watched it because I wasn't allowed to watch it. I was quite young and I think it was Blood on Satan's Claw. And that was kind of quite creepy. And I found that genuinely scary, to the point where I got up in the night and wanted to go to the loo, but I couldn't because I was too scared to go out of the room. It had that effect of thinking what's out there. I would have been 10 or 11, something like that. I suppose that kind of hooked me in. And Harry notes, the earliest film I remember watching was probably Halloween Resurrection. It was being screened on TV. I wasn't really big into horror when I was a kid, so I just sat down and watched it. My mum said you can watch it with me, but if you have nightmares, that's your own fault. You take responsibility for it. So me being a kid, I thought it's not going to scare me. Looking back on it now, it's not a very good film, one of the weaker Halloween sequels. But at the time, I was terrified. I had to go to sleep with a nightlight on. I had my mum take me in and show me that everything was okay. What an experience. And in terms of kind of re-experiencing or reliving this personal event memory and nostalgically reflecting on it, many of the Dirt in the Gate interviewees also had outlined, including in some of these memories here, how that initial experience of being scared has kind of fixed itself to these films in these subsequent viewings of them. Or in the last case at the bottom there from Harry, to these subsequent encounters with horror films more broadly. The last quote from Harry there talks about this idea of chasing the scare becoming an appeal of horror, that initial experience that you have of being scared by a horror film is something you're constantly trying to achieve in the future. So what is evident, I think, in all these examples is not only the ways in which the sensation or feeling of being scared is at the center of the memorability of these early encounters with horror, but also the ways in which these scares, what they felt like, and the consequences of them, nightmares, sleepless nights, leaving the light on, making me feel something, are returned to and nostalgically reflected upon when these interviewees recall their viewing history with a particular film or their history of viewing horror in general. And this is something that clearly is returned to and feeds into the nostalgic pleasure of watching these films in the Dirt in the Gate event, something that in May's terms brings vitality to the present and a sense of continuity of self as they see these films that had that effect on them in their youth projected in this context. I'll finish there.
Amazing, Kate. Thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I particularly enjoyed the discussion of kind of the role of the family and people's connections with parents and siblings and uncles and so on. And if ever there was a point to say, my mum's actually here and she's just texted me in the middle of it, that's now. My mum's here. She's just texted me in the middle of it to say that I didn't get it from her. So fair enough. We've only got 10 minutes for questions, but we do have quite a long break after the next panel. So I'm going to ask people to keep their questions concise if possible, but we're happy to open those up now for Kate. Anybody want to kick us off? Got one here straight away. Okay, so one from Colleen. Does horror, more than other genres, require some kind of family initiation?
I think You could argue to an extent it does. I mean, that's certainly something that we found through the Alien Audiences research that we did. And I mentioned Martin Smith's excellent thesis. Certainly in both of those projects, when people were recalling their first encounters with horror films, the family were kind of key, because of the fact that often these, as I mentioned in the paper, these people watching these films, these children watching these films, were underage at that particular time, and therefore family members play that kind of gatekeeper role. Certainly if you're thinking post 1960s, if you're thinking about the fact that, you know, as Martin Smith has argued, many audiences are encountering films that from that point onwards much more frequently in their first encounters within the home environment, and they're underage, they're children. Therefore, you know, in certain respects, parents enable that kind of access to these kind of texts. I mean, something that I didn't unfortunately have the time to talk about was another idea I'm very interested in, which relates to something which was discussed way earlier in the first panel of kind of a temporal and spatial nostalgia. This idea that there are kind of what I would call access zones that are recalled nostalgically by horror fans when they're thinking back to their childhood viewing of horror in the home. Access zones that enable them to access horror films, which usually are, you know, not always, but usually are 18. So it requires audience members, sometimes in special occasions, to have that opportunity of access to a particular horror film. That may be because a mother or father has showed it to them, but if a parent hasn't shown it to them or forbids them from watching it, those access zones could relate to, and this was certainly the case when people talked about this in the Alien project, going around their grandmother's house, or one of those memories talked about an uncle Gary, that played that particular role. Or potentially, and this is something that I really want to explore at further length, and if people know of research on this, I'd be really interested. When people during that particular era in the 80s, you know, that a lot has been thought about in terms of home video, but when people acquired their own televisions in their rooms, when people had portable televisions as children, that also created a kind of an access zone that people have a nostalgia for, when people were able, you know, after their parents had gone to bed, to maybe watch, you know, partial viewings of horror films, maybe with the sound turned down very low, but that technology actually enabling people in the home to, you know, access horror at a very young age, and people having a nostalgia for that. I don't know if any work's been done on nostalgia for portable televisions or memories of portable televisions, but it's something, if people know of anything, I'd be really interested to know about. But to go back to the question, what that illustrates, and this is something that a lot of scholarship in this area is consistently arguing about the family, is that families either function in these memories, often associated with horror, because they're enabling access to child audiences to horror, or they're preventing access, and therefore children have to find these other kind of access zones in which to encounter them.
Fantastic, thank you. Certainly sounds very familiar. Sorry, Mum. We've got a question from Craig Clark.
Hi Kate, thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. It got me thinking about my own childhood memories in the 90s, not of seeing films, but of encountering them in different ways. So some of what you said resonates there with like being like an auntie's house and a cousin watching People Under the Stairs and catching a glimpse of it, and that being enough to frighten me. And then when we were at school, I remember like Candyman was a big trope, and you kind of became scared of mirrors. Now I've never even seen Candyman, but that memory is just so strong that it still reappears, and I wondered if that's something either that you've explored, thought about exploring it, or has come up in people's memories when they've been talking to you.
So do you mean actually not encountering a film, but instead having memories of people telling you about films?
So yeah, you're kind of encountering the film without actually seeing it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that I was fascinated with when doing my research on video nasties. that people had these nostalgic memories of not only encountering these films, but of hearing about them and of swapping stories about them at school. And it's something I've also considered in relationship to a non-horror text, which is Monty Python, where I've actually explored people's memories of first encountering Monty Python in the home, not through watching it in television or film form, but actually hearing about it through their parents recounting sketches as bedtime stories. And I think absolutely it very much is a kind of text, a horror text that permeates people's childhood, along with those other forms of mediated horror texts, which is in the form of either bits of or the whole of a film or a television programme. And just like you, I remember those stories from my own childhood, because I was so absolutely scared of horror when I was a child, and also other kinds of adult films. So I remember, I'm always talking about this, I remember the child who did this, who came up to me at school and told me about RoboCop. So it wasn't necessarily a horror film, but the bit in RoboCop where the character falls into the nuclear waste, and used to recount that scene to me over and over and over again. So I had it kind of implanted in my head, even though I hadn't seen the film at that particular point. So I absolutely think that's right. I think we, when thinking about how horror media permeates people's memories of childhood, we need to think about those kind of second-hand accounts of horror and how people encounter them, even if they're trying to avoid particular films. I think they can be just as potent, if not more so.
Thanks, I agree completely.
We've got just very, very quickly one that's coming from Beth in there. We've got some comments as well in the chat, which I'll leave for you to read in your own time, Kate, after this. But just one last question very quickly from Bethan. A lot of Bethan's friends, sorry, it just disappeared. A lot of my access was through sleepovers with early teenage female friends. One night they watched Poltergeist and I slept in another room because I refused to watch it. Wondering how common that is with young girls. I'd say very.
Yeah, and Bar. I mean, certainly in Martin Smith's research on the Exorcist, and I encourage everyone to look at his thesis, it's fantastic. He talks about sleepovers as being a key, if we return to that idea of access zones, when you're not able to kind of access horror directly in the home, that sleepovers are really, really key. They are, I agree, often associated with girls, but there are also accounts of men and mixed gender sleepovers as well, being those kind of spaces that give you kind of access to horror films that you might not be able to encounter otherwise. So yes, I think it would be something it's definitely something that's worth exploring further, and I'm very keen to do so.
Yeah, I think that'd be really valuable. I'm really sorry we've got interesting chat coming in, but I think I'm going to leave you to pick up on anything that you'd like to after this. And I'd just like to thank you once more for a fantastic paper and some really interesting answers to people's questions. If everybody would just like to join me in thanking Kate.
Thank you so much, and sorry I overran a little bit.
It was absolutely fine. It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Discussion. So thank you very much. I will read all of those comments in the chat. So thank you, everyone.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you.